Chapter 2: The Second Origin. On the morning of my first birthday, I woke up to an uncomfortable feeling. There were rocks and pebbles in my bed. I sat up and looked around. There weren't any rocks or anything else around the bed or anywhere in the room, apart from the standard gems and geodes set out as decorations. I couldn't help but laugh. It had worked. I'd worked all night with purpose to learn my very first spell. Dwarves couldn't enter the Fade, and because they didn't have that connection, they couldn't cast magic. But for whatever reason, I could access the Fade. I assumed it was because I had originally been a human in my first life. So when I finally found myself in the Fade, I worked with a spirit of purpose to learn a single spell. Dream time was relatively slower than time in the real world, and I had spent it all practicing rock armor. Evidently, I had managed to cast it in the real world while I was sleeping. I stood up and steadied myself before calling the magic forth. The spell was simple enough, and maybe it was my dwarven connection to the stone that made it easier, but as soon as I pulled the mana from my reserves, a thin layer of rock and stone formed over my small frame. It was like a carapace that allowed me to move freely, but kept me safe. I would need to test the strength of the armor, but for now, it was better than nothing. "Trian!" I called out. Trian had basically become my nanny in almost every way. He helped me get dressed and would carry me to breakfast, the only time he didn't make me walk. The door to my bedroom opened, and in came Trian, awake and followed by a few other dwarves who were likely still trying to finish a meeting. My room was essentially his closet, though that isn't saying it wasn't spacious. It was large enough for a 1-year-old dwarf. Trian's eyes widened as he neared my bed and spotted the rubble in my bed. He sprinted the rest of the distance to get to me, scooping me up quickly and looking around for a possible crack in the ceiling or other signs of a cave-in. "Merida? What happened here? Are you all right?" His tone was pragmatic and direct to anyone else, but I heard the worry and concern in his voice. I was more than just an intelligent child in his mind now. I was his beloved sister and a precious jewel who held great promise for the Idukan family. "I'm fine, Trian," I reassured him. "Where did all this rubble come from?" he asked quickly. I sheepishly bowed my head. "We should discuss this in private." Trian turned and waved for his courtiers to leave the room. In my first year, I had revealed some of the knowledge I had about the world to Trian. Not much, but enough so that whenever I told him I needed to speak in private, he took me seriously. He knew I was more intelligent than I let others believe, even if he didn't say it. He waited for the door to be closed, then carried me over to a tuffet where he would normally place me, while we picked out what I would wear each day. When he was satisfied that I was steady on my feet, he moved to the closet. "Mother has, no doubt, had a new outfit created for you since it's your birthday," he said patiently, as he pulled out a box from one of the shelves that contained my jewelry. "Whatever it is you need to speak to me about, do so quickly. She and Father will likely be here soon." I nodded and stood on my tiptoes to look into the box, pointing out suggestions for the pieces I would wear for my birthday. "I have learned that I can cast magic, Trian. Just one spell so far, but that's what made the mess." "Don't speak such nonsense," Trian snapped. He cared a great deal for me, but he didn't brook foolish, pointless talk. "Dwarves can't cast magic, so don't lie to me." I popped the edge of the box to grab Trian's attention. "I'm not lying. I can cast the rock armor spell. I've been practicing all night, and I can prove it." Trian's expression grew stern, the way it would when he was on the verge of yelling at a servant. "Can you now?" He placed the box down with a hard thump, his frustration clear with the motion. "Very well then, prove it. But the moment you can't..." I didn't give him the chance to finish the thought. I called the mana to me, and the rocks and stones returned to me, covering me up to my neck in a carapace of stone once more. Trian froze in shock as he stared at me. I stood there defiantly, proud in my thin layer of rock and stone. "Well?" I asked. "Do you believe me now?" Trian snapped his head back to the door, paranoid that anyone might have come in since I cast the spell. He looked back at me and waved his hand sharply. "Be rid of that this instant. We cannot let anyone know about this until we speak with the shape rate of memories. People may try to abduct you or kill you for your unique abilities." "What about Mother and Father?" I replied. "Should we not tell them?" "Not yet," Trian lowered his voice. "Father would be too proud and would announce your abilities right away. We need to ensure that you are capable enough with them to defend yourself before we tell anyone else. The concern in Trian's voice actually surprised me. Even as I stumbled and fell while I was getting used to walking, Trian had never sounded genuinely concerned for my health. With such concern coming from Trian, I nodded in agreement. "As you wish, Trian," I said meekly. I sometimes forgot that I was still just a child. Not even a child. I was a toddler, physically at least. "I won't tell anyone else, and I won't show anyone else what I can do until you think I'm capable of defending myself." "Good," he said flatly. He stood and made his way to the door. "I'll get a servant to clean up the rubble. You pick out your jewelry." Later that day, I sat at the head of one of the long tables in the throne room. Mother had indeed commissioned a new dress for me. It was made of padded garnet fabric with golden thread designs, brass corner clips, and silver studs. Father had commissioned a thin, golden tiara that was studded with precious jewels and silver clan designs. I looked quite royal. Trian insisted on sitting to my left, with Father and Mother to my right. Among the guests at the dinner were more family members, friendly nobles, and a few select nobles that were of little note, and some members of the warrior caste. Family and friends ate, drank, sang, played games, and wished me well. Most seemed to think my early intelligence and quick progression to walking and talking were a sign of great things to come. Trian thought that most of the people who attended were only here to garner favor. He was likely right. I had no intention of anyone making me a part of their plans. I had plans of my own. As the celebrations reached their peak, and I had accepted gifts from all in attendance, Father stood and called for everyone's attention. "I wish to thank you all for coming here today to celebrate the birthday of my daughter, Princess Merida." Fists and mugs hammered the tables in good spirits to signal approval of the speech thus far. "While my daughter has thanked each one of you personally for your gifts, I wish to convey my thanks as well," Father continued. "Traditionally, my wife and I would now give our gifts to the princess, but as you can no doubt see, she is already wearing them. My wife gifted her the beautiful dress she is wearing, each piece meticulously crafted by the talented Ferris family." More thumping fists and mugs, this time as the head of the Ferris family stood and took a bow for his family's efforts. "My wife gifted our daughter with the tiara she now wears. It was crafted with all care by the craftsmen of the Silria family." More applause as the head of the Silria family stood and waved. "There is one among us, however, who has not given the princess a gift yet," Father said as he turned and looked to Trian. "Prince Trian, my son, are you prepared to give your gift to your sister?" Trian stood and nodded firmly. "I am, Father." "Very well," Father replied and waved to Trian as he took his seat. "Present your gift." Trian placed his hands behind his back and stood tall, looking out over the gathered guests. "As you all will no doubt have noticed over the past year, I have taken it upon myself to look after Princess Merida's well-being. I have seen to her education and etiquette. However, I have mounting responsibilities, and I understand that her view of our world cannot be shaped by my perception and opinions alone." He smiled down at me, then moved across the throne room to a door that was reserved for the staff to come in and out as they brought food and drink and cleared out empty dishes. "As such, I have searched high and low for someone who would be as dedicated in her upbringing as I would be, someone who would dedicate their very life and the lives of their family to ensuring my sister's safety and upbringing. I am happy to say that I have found that someone." He opened the door to reveal a female dwarf who might have been called beautiful, if not for a severe burn scar covering her right cheek. Standing next to her were a 5-year-old girl and a 3-year-old boy. Murmurs of confusion, shock, and abhorrence spread throughout the guests. "Silence!" Trian barked. To his credit, the guests stopped their murmuring. He let the silence settle for several moments before continuing. "This is Kala Broska and her 2 children Rika and her son Farron. I met Kala in the market and watched as she and her children ran a small stall. Even at their young ages, Rika and Farron were quick to organize their merchandise, keep the stall clean, and bark for their mother's wares. If she could raise 2 such young, industrious children like that, I could only imagine what she would do for my sister." Trian began escorting the family to the table where I was seated. He was putting on a good show. I knew this wasn't something he wanted to do, but I had convinced him that this would be to his advantage. "I will be taking new quarters in the palace soon, and my sister will be taking over my current rooms," Trian continued. Kayla has dedicated herself to the well-being of my sister and has dedicated her children to befriending and caring for the princess as well. Silence gripped the room as Kala, Rika, and Farin took their places behind me. I smiled at Farin, who smiled back. Tree Ann stood beside me and placed a hand on my shoulder as he continued to address those gathered. No doubt you've noticed that Kala was castless from the burn mark on her cheek, where her brand was removed. She did this to herself when she swore her life, and the lives of her children, to Princess Merida. To reward such dedication, I have worked with the Shapers to elevate her and her children to the servant caste. If I hear even a whisper of dissent, or of someone speaking to them as if they were casteless, I will personally see that person's throat opened. So, what say you all to my gift? The room was as silent as the stone for several moments until Veron Bastol, a lesser noble of no real notoriety, stood. I commend the prince in his efforts to find someone who would dedicate themselves so much to our princess. Before anyone else could say anything, Trental Harbin, another lesser noble, stood. I agree. Our prince shows his considerable judgment and immense generosity in this gift. 2 generations of caretakers for the princess who he has elevated from the dregs of the Castelless. A toast to Prince Trian, a toast to Princess Merida. Ors Amar's future is truly bright with such admirable successors to the Idukan line. Not wanting the intense moment to continue, every guest in the room, as well as father and mother, raised their cups to the toast. A cry of "To Prince and Princess Idukan" was called out over and for several minutes. By the time it died down, no one bothered to even look at the caretaker's way. Trian took his seat beside me once again and looked at me. There, you have your promised servants. Are you sure this will be worth it? I smiled at my brother and nodded. Lord Bastel and Lord Harbin will be in your debt till the end of their days. I still don't know why you wanted them, of all people, to be here, he replied curtly. Because, I said with a little smirk, Lord Bastol is the father of Rika, and Lord Harbon is Farron's father. Trian tried to hide his surprise as he looked at me. What? How do you know? When you were speaking to Kala in the market, I was speaking to Rika and Farron, I explained. You thought we were playing, but Farron is more important than you know. When I heard Kala's name and Farron introduced himself, I knew who I was dealing with. The only thing I didn't know was the name of their fathers. I asked you to make them my caregivers for my birthday because I knew Farron would become a great warrior, and I knew the political currency they held with their fathers. So you waited to have me reveal them as your caretakers until now, so that Vernon and Trental would recognize Kala and quickly silence any questions by agreeing with what people would think was my decision, Trian asked in amazement. This was the first time I felt that he was truly inspired by my actions. I nodded happily. That's right. And they no doubt believe you already knew they were the fathers of Kayla's children. While Lord Harbin might not be seen in too negative of a light for having sired a son with Kayla, Lord Bastel would be dishonored for having sired a daughter and not raising Kayla and Rika up. And Bastel would still see some dishonor for knowingly bedding someone who should rightfully be a member of another noble family, Trian finished. One day, sister, you'll tell me how you knew about all of this. But I'll wait, because it's your birthday, but you still gifted the Idukan family with the compliance of 2 noble families. You're welcome, Trian, I giggled. Once the ceremony was over and the guests had gone, Trian carried me back to my room with Kala, Rika, and Farron in tow. At the door to the room, he gave me a hug, then handed me over to Kala. She is your responsibility now, Trian said in all seriousness. Care for her like your life, and the lives of your children depend on it, because they do. Kala curtsied with a quiet, "As you command, my prince." I looked up at Trian and clicked my tongue at him. This is no time for threats. She's my caretaker now, so treat her with kindness. Trian let out a doubtful hum before taking his leave. Be sure to keep to her schedule. I expect you to have her at her lessons on time. Kayla bowed her head as Trian walked away. As you command, my prince. Rika opened the door and we entered my room, which had been renovated to be a small living quarters for the family. Kayla carried me over to the changing area while Rika and Farron looked around the room. This room is bigger than our home, Rika said in amazement. I told you it would be, Farron said as he placed his things on one of the new beds, claiming it as his own. Get the princess nightgown. You're not my boss, Rika argued. Rika, Kala said as she carefully undid the clasps on my outfit. Do as your brother says. He's helped us get this far. You can take a little more direction from him. Rika huffed and went to fetch one of my gowns as Farron sat down next to me. So you actually pulled it off. I'm pretty impressed. I told you I'd get you and your family here, and I meant it, I replied. And we're eternally grateful to your majesty for your effort, Kala said, as she took great pains to handle the new outfit with care. I'd all but given up when I was left to waste away in Dust Town for a second time. Farron has been so remarkable in helping us thrive. But when you took an interest in us that day... Kayla started to cry, but Farron pat her arm. It's all right, Mother. Princess Merida is like me. She has knowledge of this world from before she was born. She'll help keep us safe, and together we can build a new Orzammar. I leaned forward and hugged Kala's neck. I promise you that your faith in me will be rewarded, and that Rika and Farron will become nobles one day. We'll be nobles? Rika squealed with delight. Do you promise? Her Majesty said she promised, so that's a promise, Farron answered for me. I smiled at them. Trian would always look out for me, however he could, but Kala, Rika, and Farron were my keys to my plans for the future. What I never told Trian was that Farron had been Isekai just like I had been. He was 3 years older than I was, and had spent his time bartering with merchants, using certain items he knew he could sell for more than he would buy them for. While I wasn't expecting to meet their family so soon, it was thanks to Farron that Trian and I had happened upon them while we were walking through the market district one day. Farron was smart enough to ensure that their stall had their family name on it. He'd done this so that if another person happened to be in his same circumstances in Orzammar, they might recognize it and speak to them. It was an idea that paid off. I had wailed and swatted at Trian, insisting on stopping at that stall. They were only selling used goods, which Trian would never stoop to even spitting on, but he stopped all the same for my sake. As soon as Trian started speaking to Kala, I went to her children and introduced myself. When Farron gave me his name, I was overjoyed. Farron Broska was the default name of the dwarf commoner origin. Being careful not to be too obvious with my knowledge, I asked why his mother was selling used goods when she looked like she might be better at cleaning chimneys. Farron caught on quickly and asked if my friend Balin would be along anytime soon. I told him we would come back, and I would have a plan to bring him and his family into the palace. I convinced Tree and to bring them in as my caretakers. It took a few weeks of convincing. Farron convinced his mother to allow Tree and to burn off the Castellus tattoo, and to agree to care for me. The burning took him more time to convince her of than becoming a servant in the palace. After all, anything was better than Dust Town. I made sure that they were provided with clothes that were appropriate for the personal servants of the princess. I also made Tree and promised to have Farron study under our best warriors, while Rika was educated in the mercantile arts. All in all, the plan had gone perfectly. I had 3 new caretakers, 2 noble families to call upon if I ever needed scales tipped in my favor, and 1 person who was from the same world I was from, who was also one of the other origin characters. If all went according to plan, they would be nobles in the next few years.